the fine grain exhibition that is on view both here in Hamwell and over in the library is a project that we undertook with today's guest. It's a project that's been over 2 years in the making, and we're happy that you're here today to be able to hear in detail about the exhibition itself. Before I start talking about Abram, I would like to call your attention to an exhibition that we currently have on view in the Ross Museum. It's an exhibition titled Tamarind Touchstones, Fabulous at 50. We have 61 lithographic prints that are here for the balance of the semester. They have come to us from Tulane University in New Orleans. They are on a national tour, and we're very fortunate to be able to include them, or to be included in the tour, and have those works here at Ohio Wesleyan. So I would encourage you to stop in the museum and take advantage of this really wonderful exhibition. And I would mention quickly that admission is free, and you're always welcome. Next thing on the list is, I'd like you to think just a moment about what it would be like if you yourself were standing up here talking to a group, and you looked out in the group, in the audience, and you saw people with their heads down because they're texting during the talk. So I'm asking you now to please turn off all of your electronic devices out of common courtesy to our visitor. Very much appreciated by me and by our visitor. Abram Kaplan, as I said earlier, came to Ohio Wesleyan with a project that was in the journal stage over 2 years ago, and asked if we would be partners in that project, being willing to exhibit it here when it reached fruition. We agreed to do that. And just by coincidence, the theme of his project dovetailed perfectly with this year's National Colloquium program. Abram has his A.B. degree from Wesleyan College. He has his M.S. degree from in Land Resources program at the Institute of Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He has a PhD from the Department of City and Regional Planning at the University of North Carolina. He has made presentations at numerous professional conferences and has numerous publications to his credit as well. For me to go over the entire list of those things would be longer than his talk itself. He has exhibited his photographs in a number of solo and group exhibitions, as well as a long list of jury shows where his work was accepted as a result of being deemed worthy by the juror for each one of those shows. Abram will be talking this afternoon about the project, and so without further ado, Abram Kaplan.
Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, you're quiet. Oh, that's not good. Thank you, Justin. Appreciate your introduction. So I'm going to talk to you about this thought, what you see is what you get. Getting the picture of food and art, and some of the transformations that have happened to me as I have come into this world of art myself. So I teach largely environmental studies over at Denison University, and I often teach with a lot of data and stats, as a good social scientist should. You heard from my little bit of a resume that my background is mostly in the social sciences. And some numbers stand out more than others. And these ones really caught my attention. This notion that in the history of our country, that we've gone from being a society where basically everybody lived on a farm in the 1700s. Everybody had some direct connection with the source of their food. Through this long period where we have seen, basically every 20 years we've lost another 10% or so of people who have that direct visceral kind of interaction with what they eat. Down to now where we don't have 10% to lose anymore. Now we're down to, I think this year it's 1.3% of the US population lives or even works on farms. So that had a really transformative impact on me. And I guess one piece of that is that as we think about those numbers, those are tied directly to how we as people relate to the food that we eat. And so we went from this place where we had direct and, as I said, that visceral connection, that experiential connection with our food, through a period when certainly pretty much everybody had somebody in their family who was involved in farming, who was involved in the food system, so a relational and a connected mode, to a place where we had sort of a vicarious connection, maybe a grandparent, or maybe we knew somebody who had some involvement in the farm, to this point now where we have no connection whatsoever to our food. We are so distant from it that we don't know what we're eating probably 90% of the time. Or maybe I'll just speak for myself. For me, that new bloom, as John Dewey talks about, was about seeing, and was about seeing anew, seeing in ways that I had never seen before, and recognizing a pitfall in my own education and in my own teaching, as well as in the way that I come to know things, in the way that I experience the world around me. And there's plenty to talk about in the food system. I think you all have had a lot of those conversations already in the Bite series this year. And it's kind of overwhelming, isn't it? I mean, where do you start? And the list of kind of challenges that we have, from the grandiose, like deforestation, down to the very personal, such as body image, are all by themselves just tremendous and reach out across every discipline you can imagine, every way of thinking you can imagine. And indeed, the number of opportunities that we have in our food system to think in different ways about how we might get food from farm to plate, and how we might grow things differently. The thought that cows maybe could be outside, heaven forbid. Things like that are just kind of remarkable in and of themselves, some of them for seeming so obvious in a certain way, and some of them for really stretching our imagination, or stretching our imagination in how come they're not being done more. And through all of these kinds of things, I really found myself asking a whole lot of questions about how connected we are to our food system, or how connected I am, and whether that is something that demands a scientific, social sciencey, or hard sciencey kind of approach, or whether there's some other ways to look at that. What it would mean to be immersed in our food system, to think about it or be part of it, not just in terms of eating, but in terms of being cognizant of all of the pieces in that. And this absolutely crazy thought that perhaps a visual way of thinking about the world, an aesthetic way of thinking about the world, might have something to do with how we perceive ourselves and how we place ourselves in the food system. And so these questions a few years ago really took me over. And I should say that 10 years ago, I didn't know I had any artistic interest whatsoever. This kind of happened to me. I can tell you that story if you want, but this is new for me. to think in this visual way, to imagine myself as an artist, much less to come to the director of the Ross Art Museum and say, hey, would you like my art in your exhibitions? And Justin was brave in saying yes, especially back then when I didn't have much to show for myself. Some of you may think that's still true now. I also found that some of my subjects seemed to be having some questions too. I'm still not sure what they were asking. I don't speak cow, but they were asking something, and they definitely looked at me curiously as I would go and take their pictures. And all of what you're seeing in this PowerPoint are my own photographs. And so out of this evolution for myself, this notion that maybe seeing had something to do with knowing, and that my own perceptions about what I eat and where it comes from demanded an exploration through visual kinds of approaches, all led me to this thing called fine grain, which you now have getting in your way when you try to eat lunch. And so fine grain is the result of a lot of different components, and it is thanks in large part to a grant from the Great Lakes Colleges Association, which you are a part of, just as Denison is. They have a fund called or a grants program called the New Directions Initiative. It's in its last year right now. I refer to it as the Midlife Crisis Fund. It's people who have kind of ventured down a certain path and then discovered that perhaps they had other interests and they want to try them out. The physicist who gets interested in dance and wants to understand the mechanics of dance, would be a sort of a classic case of the New Directions Initiative. They were a little perplexed by me when I came in and said, I have a PhD in city and regional planning and I want to study the food system through art. That was a bit out of what they had imagined. And they weren't sure that they wanted to fund me at all, but they ended up being very generous in making this project possible. So this exhibition is traveling to different colleges around the Midwest, and it's intended to try to ask questions and get other people to explore this possibility of seeing the food system in some new ways, and I hope it has that potential for you. The way I have imagined this exhibition is not to be passive two-dimensional photographs on the wall, but to be active, interactive, immersive, three-dimensional photographs in your face. Just as food is in your face, this art is meant to as well, and it's meant to maybe force you through walking on it or sitting by it or spinning a triangle around as fast as you can or whatever to have to ask some questions that perhaps you wouldn't when you look at art on the wall. I find that my interaction with artwork is very different when I am forced to engage with it, not forced by somebody else, but forced by the medium itself, than when I can take the easy way out and just walk by. So this is what I call sculptural photography. Everything that you see in this exhibition is photographs, sometimes printed on very strange materials, but nonetheless, every bit of it is photography. The other piece of this grant project is that at the various schools, at Denison and at Kenyon and at Mount Vernon Nazarene over this last year, I worked with a variety of different classes, in some cases giving them tours of the art, in some cases having the students go and visit the artwork on their own, and then I would come in and they would throw tomatoes at me and tell me how awful it was, or whatever. I mean, that just an interactive way of imagining what was involved there, and I learned a ton from the students as they would respond to what they saw. So I'll just take you through briefly the elements of the artwork, since you've had a chance, presumably, to engage with it some. First I want to talk a bit about the panoramic image called nutrient cycle, and then I'll next talk about the flooring below it. So, nutrient cycle, we think about the fact of when we are drinking milk that came from a cow, and that cow was presumably eating something, grass or grain, to be able to produce that milk. We think about the lactation cycle that the cow goes through. We think about the life cycle of that process, and we think about the crop growing cycle that is necessary to make it possible for the cows to even be able to do that. And so this panorama is meant to try to get at some of that and to look at some of issues of identity. You know, as I said, I've been trying to figure out some aspects of my own identity through this artistic endeavor this path I've been going down, and am on the early stages of myself. But then to think about what the lives of these cows are like, and what it is that, you know, that means dignity when we think about an animal, and whether being indoors versus outdoors has anything to do with that. The inside and outside of this panorama is very much essential to that. So that's just one little piece of this 50-foot long image that you see on the inside of the panorama. And on the outside is a look at the crop cycle. This is the early stages of soybeans growing in the stubble of corn from the last year, as most farmers plant, as they would say, corn on corn or corn on soybeans, meaning the rotation of crops that they plant. Generally speaking, in Ohio is going to be corn and beans. That's pretty much what we grow in this state as a general rule. And to try to capture that in a visually, hopefully somewhat appealing way, or at least a representative way. So again, that's just one little piece of that 50-foot ring, which is the outside of this. And so these cows are contained in that system and have little in the way of choice about how they exist in that system. And there are times when I feel somehow contained within that food system myself, with perhaps little choice, or I come to make myself believe that I have little choice in terms of how I eat, or what I eat, or what choices that I might have. So there are times when I do indeed feel much like a cow. Stover is the technical term, I guess you could say, for corn stubble. That's just what corn stubble is called. If you were to ask someone at an agricultural school, that would be the term they would know. And if you look down on that image from the floors above in the atrium area, you'll see that this is not just, I mean, when you look at it up close, you just see stubble, but when you back away from it, you see that it is actually a series of different pictures. There are a huge number of images in this. This was printed directly on press board. It's a standard board that's used for building houses. Originally, the plan was to print it on a brand new material called corn board, made by the Corn Board Company in Texas. And they were going to supply me with sheets of corn board so that I could print corn on corn, a joke you should get now. And they decided that they really wanted not to make a board for building materials, but for long skateboards instead, made out of cornboard. And in fact, the world speed record on a skateboard was just set on a cornboard board. So they've gotten themselves famous, but I didn't get any cornboard from them. This set of images follows the growth pattern from wintertime, when there is nothing growing on the corn stubble, through the summer or through the early spring, as soybeans are coming up through it. And so the idea here is that when you stand in the middle of that panorama and you have the image of the soybeans growing around you, if you were to look straight down, that's what you would see depending on the time of year. So I actually did stand in this exact spot to take the panoramic image. That's the outside image of the ring. So just some close-ups there. And part of what I'm trying to get at with the Stover growth installation is what it really means to be immersed. What does it mean to go to a place and to be part of it? In this case, I went week after week after week to that same spot in that same cornfield and had to walk out to the middle of the field across many acres to find my place, to find the point where I wanted to be part of that environment and to, in a sense, really live it. I suppose I could have gone to the extreme mode of pitching my tent in the middle of the field and living more intensively there. I didn't have that opportunity when I was doing this project, but my kids wouldn't have appreciated it much either. Well, maybe they would have. But anyway, this also gave me an opportunity more technically to look at shadow and light and depth and focus and a lot of issues that photographers struggle with, that painters struggle with all the time, to just try to understand the environment around me and to capture it in a way that was meaningful and that had some emotional quality and not purely just a representative quality. I also wanted for you to create an environment. I want you to, in a sense, feel like you are in a field when you are standing there in a way that you otherwise perhaps might not have the opportunity to do. I find probably 90 to 95% of my students have never been to a farm before. I take them to farms in my classes, but this artwork is meant to give people an opportunity to feel some little piece of that, as it does for me. That thing standing in the middle of the floor is not a missile silo, but a corn or grain silo. It's called MultiGrain for a variety of reasons. One, that it is meant to, silos hold a variety of different grains in them, depending on what the farmer is growing in a particular year. And what I'm showing you in these images is not the installation here, since you get to see that one live, but instead some of where it has been at other schools. And I'm very interested in the imperviousness of a silo. Usually they're made out of metal or ceramic or concrete. In this case, each of the shingles or tiles is a photograph I took of a ceramic silo in Pataskala, Ohio, which is fairly near Granville, where I live, that was about to be torn down. And I wanted to sort of record that silo before it was lost. And then with the help of a number of other people, was able to print that photograph directly on galvanized steel and had it rolled or curved to the proper dimensions so that it could be set on a steel frame that makes up the overall silo. And there's this question about, well, we don't know what our food system is going to look like in the future. We found out this summer what happens when it gets awfully dry and corn is not available, and feed then becomes a scarce resource, and farmers aren't sure what they're going to do. And so silos became a very critical part of the food system this summer and are this fall as well, as we try to work our way out of the drought that we have suffered in this country. And as climate change takes its increasing toll on how we grow things and where we grow certain things, this kind of containment and imperviousness becomes more and more a central feature of the food system, which is sort of at odds with farming as a very open system, something that's not impervious at all. And in fact, the more you drive tractors on soil, the harder that soil gets, the more compacted it is, the more impervious it becomes, and the less able you are to grow things on it. So having these impervious structures is kind of a challenging kind of issue when compared with the sort of natural order of farming, if there is such a thing. Trifocal is the triangles that are over in the library, and these are an attempt to, for one thing, show the dairy system. With, on one side, we have the cows being milked at a dairy up in Utica, Ohio. Then we have the trucks that carry that milk to the United Dairy processing plant, which is in Martins Ferry, over on the West Virginia, well, actually no, the Pennsylvania line on the eastern end of Ohio. And I should say in the middle we have the cows in their barn, taking their time eating, in this case, right after being milked. And there are three formalist images there that you can come to find by turning the triangles around. But what I find more interesting than that, perhaps, is the number of intermediate images that you can create for yourself. I exhibit my work at some art fairs. In fact, the Ann Arbor Art Fair is one that I like to include my work in. And a couple years in a row, I have taken very small little models of trifocal with me. And I find when people come into my little booth and they look at my artwork, mostly they take that passive kind of excursion and look at two-dimensional photos and walk away. But when they are confronted with this little series of triangles, the kid in them comes out and they start to play and they start to explore what kind of art they can make with those triangles. The most amazing thing that I discovered, and I did this before making these large ones that are 8 feet tall, was that a person would come and arrange these triangles the way they wanted, and they would then walk away, and someone else would come into the booth and make their own thing, and the first person would start yelling at the second person, saying, you know, don't you mess with my art. That was my work that you just changed. And I thought at that point, I'm onto something here. This is something really worthwhile, that people are coming to feel a sense of ownership about that they don't when they're looking passively. And so I'm hopeful that people will come and rearrange these triangles and make something of them and discover their own sensibility about what's involved in these. When this exhibition was mounted at Denison, the triangles were in the dining hall, and they were put right across from where the milk section was in the main dining hall. And it was a lot of fun listening to Denison students who would sit, especially with the cows being milked right behind them, and say, why do I have to sit next to these rear ends of cows while I'm drinking my milk? Exactly. So there are many opportunities that sort of shift your viewpoint as you think about the food system, and especially about the cycle here. This, actually, you can see the tables in the dining hall at Denison there. For instance, somebody had arranged these such that the cows were on the left and the milk trucks were on the right, and it just so happens that there was a line that appeared down the middle, which line looks, on the one hand, to be the line down the middle of a highway, but in fact that's the sunlight coming through the roof of the milking barn. And so this was just a perfect example of that juxtaposition of two worlds and how they come together through somebody discovering it. I had not known that juxtaposition was there until somebody else pointed that out to me, or pointed it out to themselves, and I happened to walk by. Well, WYSIWYG, you now know, that stands for what you see is what you get. And all these barn windows that are cluttering up the food court area are an assemblage together that make up that. These are a variety of different looks at and looks through dimensions of our food system. And that was how it looked at Denison. This is how it looked when it was in Mount Vernon this last spring. You guys got a whole bunch of new ones that no one else has seen before. And I have more that I'm working on now. But these are really aimed at I guess the ways in which we think about seeing. The fact that when we look through a window, our eyes, our brains sort of have trained themselves to not see the window at all. There are layers of things that we don't notice at all. We look through a window and we see the view beyond it, but we don't pay attention to the medium we look through very often. And our experience with the food system is in a lot of ways very, very similar to that. So there are many layers of meaning that come out when you're forced to look at the window, and by having these images printed in a sort of transparent medium so that you are seeing the window but also seeing through it, I hope to try to achieve that. Windows also, of course, offer us a reflection back on ourselves, and so this is another emphasis on looking at identity more directly. And then the last piece of the exhibition is the little greenhouse that you see down on what I call the terrace, down in your atrium. I don't know what you guys call it. And it's the Four Seasons room. And this is meant to be an enclosed space to go in, and that really only makes sense when you're inside, and it doesn't make so much sense when you're outside. I hope some of you have snuck around the outside of it and sort of walked around in that little tiny space that's left between it and the railing. But its point is really to get at some of the feelings that we have as outsiders when we come into the food system, and what is our experience when we come into, if we were to go to a produce auction, most of us would feel pretty unsure of what the heck was going on and how we might fit into that. Well, we all have that kind of inside-outside relationship with our food, and to think about that visually, to think about what we see, how we see, what it means to participate in that in a visual way, is really what that installation is meant to get at. Something else that I've tried to work on since taking the photographs for the fine grain exhibition is traveling to a variety of food system related places. Over the last calendar year, every single month I went to the exact same place and took pictures in that place. And so this is an apple orchard near Granville, where I went and took pictures every single month and sort of watched what happened and got to participate in the food system that way. And it leads me to wonder, if we did spend quality time in a place and got to know it well, what would that do to us? Would it make us feel differently? Would it cause us to know more? Surely it would. Surely, from at least an experiential point of view, we would feel like we had a greater sensibility about that place than we tend to have about our very 70 mile an hour down the highway kind of experience with the food system that most of us have. And John Berger really, I think, put it so profoundly that seeing is really what gives us our sense of being in a place, our way of being. We are such an incredibly visual species. 85% of the cues that we take in are through our eyes and not through our other senses, for better and for worse. That leads us to a certain way of experiencing. And yet, here we are, people who don't really experience our food system in a visual way at all. Sure, we notice whether a tomato looks nice or not, but that's about the extent of how our visual component ties in. So it seems to me we could learn an awful lot if we were to experience the world in that way. And so we've been conditioned, especially as Americans, especially as people in the Western Hemisphere, to always want to go to new places, that the way that we will see the world is by going to it. And I would like to commend instead, or in addition, the thought that perhaps staying in the same place and seeing it differently might give you as much or more than you get by running around the planet. And so we started with this notion of what you see is what you get, and the 70 mile an hour view as we drive by the food system. But I wonder whether in fact that's backwards. I think in fact really what we have is what you get is what you see. And if you see, you'll get more. So I want to thank a few people. Stephen and Matthew, I don't know if I haven't seen if they're here, but they made it workable to actually get this exhibition up over a 2-day period. That was pretty incredible. I brought a student of mine, Jacqueline Lucas, who helped as well. And a bunch of people here have been tremendous in helping make this possible, as well as the Great Lakes Colleges Association for making this happen. And I think we have a reception after this to formally open the art exhibition. And I appreciate your time, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you have. So thank you. to the reception and ask.
Okay, over here, Carol.
Question about how you see the purpose of your art. You talked at the beginning about funding, and when you did, you mentioned how this was a new exploration for you, a new direction. But given your scholarship heretofore, and the fact that you are a teacher, and given the subject matter of your work and all the issues that surround the food system, is your work, is your art and the way you present it, particularly at schools and affairs, primarily didactic, or more of a vehicle of self-expression, or somehow a balance of these two, or more one than the other?
Oh, this is the comprehensive exam question, I think. I think my work is a combination of many things, and I think at the perhaps more scholarly level, you might say, I'm very interested in the extent to which we see but we don't see, and exploring that in a variety of different venues, I guess you could say, artistic and otherwise. And so, as you know, as a people, as we in my field of environmental studies look for routes to sustainability, there is so much that we don't see, and to try to explore those in different ways and find pathways that might be more meaningful to people, I think is kind of what underlies. I mean, in terms of sort of the I wouldn't call it the ulterior motive at all, but just sort of the grounding for, the theoretical grounding for why I take the direction I do. I think that would probably be the simplest answer to that question. So. Does that get at what you were asking? Okay.
Other questions, please? As you can see on the screen, you can feel free to join us for a reception in the lobby. And as I understand it, there's food and drink awaiting your arrival. You feel free, please, when you're there, to engage in conversation with today's guest. Thank you very much for being here and for being